The filthy, brutal reality of the Victorian era. When you hear the word Victorian era, what do you see? You see elegant ladies in corsets, gentlemen in top hats, the birth of steam trains, the genius of Charles Dickens, and a prim, proper Queen Victoria ruling over a global empire where the sun never set. You see an age of progress, of invention, of romance, of morality. That is a lie. It is a carefully constructed fairy tale designed to hide a horrifying truth. The truth is that the Victorian era, which officially lasted from 1837 to 1901, was one of the most brutal, filthy, and hypocritical periods in human history. It was an age of elegance built on a mountain of filth, an age of progress powered by the broken bodies of children, an age of morality that had a dark, depraved, and monstrous underbelly. You are about to discover the story they don't tell you in the history books. This is not the story of Queen Victoria. This is the story of the real Victorian era. Let's start with the heart of the empire, London. In the Victorian imagination, it was the center of the world. In reality, it was a festering, open sore. Imagine a city choked by a permanent yellow-brown fog. Not fog, but smog, a toxic soup of coal smoke so thick that it would turn your spit black. A fog that was a silent killer, causing respiratory diseases that claimed thousands of lives. People would get lost and walk into the river in the middle of the day. This was the air they breathed. And the river? The famous River Thames was not a river. It was a thick, brown slurry of raw human waste, industrial chemicals, and rotting animal carcasses. Every single toilet in London emptied directly into the Thames. In the summer of 1858, the smell became so overpowering, a phenomenon known as the Great Stink, that Parliament had to soak their curtains in chloride of lime just to conduct business. The very river they wrote poems about was a weapon of mass destruction, brewing epidemics of cholera that would sweep through the city and kill tens of thousands in a matter of weeks. But it gets worse. Where did they get their drinking water? From that same river, companies would literally pump the sewage-infested water from the Thames, give it a token filtering, and then deliver it directly to people's homes to drink. The Victorians weren't just living in filth. They were drinking it. The Victorian era is celebrated for the Industrial Revolution. But this revolution was not powered by steam. It was powered by human suffering, and its most valuable fuel was children. Child labor wasn't just common. It was a bedrock of the economy. Forget a summer job. We are talking about 5-year-olds working 16-hour days in the dark, suffocating coal mines. Their small size made them perfect for crawling into unstable tunnels that would often collapse and bury them alive. We are talking about children in textile factories, forced to crawl under massive, high-speed machines to pick up scraps of cotton. One moment of sleepiness, one tiny mistake, and their limbs would be torn off, their bodies crushed by the very gears of progress. Many were orphans, sold from workhouses into what was essentially a life of industrial slavery. And the adults, their lives were a different kind of hell. Factory workers were crammed into slums, dark, airless, disease-ridden tenements where entire families lived in a single room. Workplace safety did not exist. There was no compensation for injury. If a machine took your arm, you were fired. If you got sick, you were replaced. You were not a person. You were a disposable, organic component in a vast, uncaring machine. The incredible wealth and progress of the era were bought with the broken bodies and short, miserable lives of the working class. If you got sick or injured in the Victorian era, you did not pray for a doctor. You prayed for a quick death, because a Victorian hospital was not a place of healing. It was a theater of butchery. For the first half of the era, anesthesia did not exist. Surgery was a conscious nightmare. You were awake. You were held down by several strong men as a surgeon, often in a blood-soaked frock coat he hadn't washed in weeks. Sawed off your leg. The operating theaters were known as screaming rooms, and the speed of the surgeon was valued far more than his precision. The faster he could cut, the less time you had to scream. Infection rates were astronomical. The surgeon would move from amputating a gangrenous leg to delivering a baby without so much as rinsing his hands. Your chances of dying from infection after the surgery were often higher than your chances of dying from the original ailment. And what about mental illness? The Victorian asylum was a human warehouse. The cures were a litany of horrors. Patients were strapped into chairs and spun at high speeds until they vomited. They were submerged in ice-cold water for hours. And for women, the diagnosis was almost always the same: hysteria. The cause? A wandering womb. The cures were even more bizarre and invasive. The asylum was not a place for recovery. It was a place where inconvenient people, especially intelligent, defiant women, were sent to be broken and forgotten. Behind the prim and proper exterior, the Victorians had a dark and deeply weird obsession: death. Death was everywhere, thanks to disease and brutal living conditions, and it became the centerpiece of their culture. Mourning was not a private affair. It was a public performance with a complex and rigid set of rules. A widow was expected to wear black for at least 2 years. They had mourning clothes, mourning jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, and even mourning stationery with black borders. But here's where it gets truly bizarre. They invented a new art form called postmortem photography, or memento mori. This was a practice of taking family portraits with the dead. Families would dress up their recently deceased children, prop them up in chairs, sometimes with their eyes propped open, and pose for one last family photo. To us, it is the stuff of horror movies. To them, it was a treasured way to remember a lost loved one. This obsession also fueled a deep-seated terror, the fear of being buried alive. Medical science was still primitive, and stories of people waking up in their own coffins were rampant. This led to the invention of safety coffins, which were equipped with bells, breathing tubes, and escape hatches, just in case you happened to wake up 6 feet under. The Victorians were so obsessed with death, they even planned for it in excruciating detail after it had already happened. The Victorian era is famous for its strict moral code. Publicly, it was an age of restraint, of family values, of propriety. But that was only during the day. The night told a different story. The same gentlemen who preached morality by day would descend into a secret underworld of opium dens, high-stakes gambling halls, and brothels. London had an estimated 80,000 prostitutes by the 1880s, many of them young girls who had been forced into the trade by poverty. And in the darkest corners of this world, a real monster was born. A monster who perfectly symbolized the hypocrisy of the age, Jack the Ripper. In 1888, the still unidentified killer terrorized the slums of Whitechapel, brutally murdering at least 5 women. The shocking violence of the crime stood in stark contrast to the era's public image of civility. The monster wasn't a foreign invader. He was one of them, a product of their own dark, secret world. So when was the Victorian era? It was from 1837 to 1901. But that is just a date range. It doesn't tell you the story. The real story is that the Victorian era was a paradox. It was a gilded cage. On the outside, it was golden, a shining symbol of progress, empire, and morality. But on the inside, it was a dark, filthy, and brutal prison for the vast majority of the people who lived in it. It was an era that gave us modern science but believed in ghosts. An era that preached family values but ran on child labor. An era that celebrated purity but was rotten with secret vices. It is a terrifying and fascinating reminder that the most polished surfaces can hide the most profound darkness. The history you were taught was a fairy tale. This was the reality.